So I want to preempt a little our Advent worship. How many of you know which hymn is turning 300 years old this year? Joy to the World. Joy to the World is turning 300 years old so we're going to have an Advent series based off of the themes of Advent, but also off of the hymn of Joy to the World. So in 2 weeks, on December 1st, I'm going to be talking about hopeful joy, how joy can be contemplative as well as it eliciting happiness. But next week, we're going to be celebrating Christ the King Sunday. And this is one of my favorite Sundays of the year because not only does it preempt Advent, and not only does it give us hope to look towards Advent, but we also talk about how Christ's death on the cross, while it seems like a solemn and a morbid kind of occasion, we can also take joy in the fact that happened because he is the King of the Jews and he has led us all to that cross. But today we're looking at something, a passage that may not be as familiar from the book of Luke. This is Luke 21, 5 through 19. I don't know how many of you will really have read it that often, but it's a good passage. Luke 21, 5 through 19. It reads this way. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Be aware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. They will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance. For I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair on your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your souls." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So this morning I want to start with a question. How many of you have gone through the most terrible experience you could ever imagine going through? Have you already been there? Have you already gone through a terrible experience, one that you didn't think you would be able to overcome? Maybe it's the death of a loved one. Maybe it's a denial of a job or something along those lines. Now let me ask you a follow-up question. Did you overcome? Were you shaped by it in some way? Did you learn something from it? I'm seeing a few nods, which is great. Well, there's nothing worse in some kids' lives than when their parents get divorced, right? When their parents end their marriage. And that's what happened to me when I was 5 years old. My parents, on my 5th birthday, decided that they signed the paperwork to get divorced. And I didn't have the best childhood growing up. It wasn't the worst, but it wasn't the best. But looking back on it, even though I, in the moment, thought that it was the worst thing that I could possibly go through, the most terrible thing that was ever going to happen to me in the moment, I realized that had to happen in order for things in the future to line up the way they did. Because if my parents did not get divorced when I was 5, we probably would have stayed in Indiana. That's where we lived at the time. I would never have moved to Michigan. I would never have heard the name Albion College, let alone transferred there when I was a sophomore. If I didn't transfer to Albion when I was a sophomore, I would never have met Elise. If I would never have met Elise, we would never have gotten married. We would never have had 2 kids. I would not have moved to Georgia, and I would not be standing right here this morning. It's interesting to see all of those events that line up from a terrible experience, right? From an experience that in the moment seemed as though it was the worst possible experience. Well, I'm going to tell you this morning something that you probably already know, but it kind of slips your mind every now and then. Even in the most terrible of moments, God is shaping you. Even in the most terrible of moments, Jesus is still right there molding you, making you become the person he wants you to become. And I think I'm cutting out, so I'm going to head up here. I'm sorry, I thought I got that figured out from last week when my mic kept cutting out, but apparently not. But even in our most terrible moments, Jesus is right there with us, molding us, telling us not to cling on to this one bad experience. I mean, even in this passage, right? The disciples were rejoicing, and they were talking about how beautiful this sanctuary was, right? How beautiful these stones were. They were placed just perfectly. You know, the cornerstone is so great. And Jesus even said, even this good thing is not going to last. Even this good thing is not going to last. Think about the terrible things. Although our sorrow may last for the night, joy comes in the morning. Friends, even in the most terrible of moment, Jesus is shaping us to become who we should become, who he wants us to become. Sometimes experiences are meant to shape us. Now, hear me clearly when I say, I don't think God or Jesus leads us to these bad experiences. I don't think they cause these bad experiences, but I think they use these bad experiences for the better. I think that they use the experiences to shape and to form us. You know that image of God sitting down at the potter wheel and molding some sort of pottery, and we're supposed to be that pottery? Think about how many trials that potter has to go through before getting the most perfect vessel they possibly could. When we were in college, Elise and I, with our chapel group, went to a local potter who he loved doing the ceramic type stuff. If you ask Elise, she has nothing but nightmares of making ceramics. But he was good at it, and he loved doing it. So, and he was telling me that I asked him how many times he had to sit down at a wheel for one piece in order to get it just perfect. And he said it takes more hours than I have in one day to sit down to make one piece of pottery. Friends, think about then how long it takes God to perfect us. There's going to be trials and tribulations when the top of that pot falls in, or when it's just not sitting right in his hands. There's going to be trials and tribulations, but he's using that to mold us, to shape us, to make us into something even better. Do you remember in all the letters that the Apostle Paul wrote, how many times he said he was shipwrecked, how many times he said he was beaten almost to death, how many times he said that he should have died, and yet he would have counted it all for gain because it happened in the Lord's name. At the end of this passage, it says, you will be persecuted, you will be arrested, some of you will be put to death in my name. Friends, those are experiences that can shape us and form us. I have a friend right now who he is in a discernment process. He was deferred by the Board of Ordained Ministry last year in all three areas that we have to interview in. And so he's in a discernment process. He's at a church that's demanding a lot of his energy and a lot of his time. His wife doesn't particularly like her job, and he has two young boys that he has to look after as well. So he's in this discernment process of where do I go from here? Do I allow myself that scrutiny again, or do I just pack it in and just say, I'll just be a licensed local pastor for the rest of the time? And another friend and I are sharing with him that we think that God is using this as a way of forming him, as a way of bringing him to, or making him become the minister he is called to be. And that made me reflect on my own path to commissioning when in 2015 I was first deferred by my first district, the North Central District, which was stationed in Macon. Then in 2016 I was deferred by the Northwest District in Columbus. 2017 I was deferred by the conference board. 2018 I was again deferred by the conference board. After those 4 deferrals, I had asked Elise, I asked her plenty of times, is this worth it? Is what I'm going through worth it? Her answer was always yes. And our answer is always yes. Even if we go through these times of what we think is the worst in the moment, it's worth it. Because God is forming and shaping us to be the people He wants us to be. He uses the bad experiences to form us. I didn't bring the hymnal back up with me, but I have one up here if I need it. But when the choir was singing that hymn, and I love the hymn that the choir sang this morning, that chorus though, it says, "When my boat's left on the shoreline behind me, you have called me." Whatever it says, I can't recall it word for word right now. But now my boat's left on the shoreline behind me, and you've called me to seek other seas. That boat is our comfort zone, right? That boat is everything we know. That boat is how we get from place to place. That boat is our home. That boat is our good things. Jesus is going to call us out upon the waters that we don't know. He's going to call us upon the waters that have never been charted before. And while we go through the experiences, while we feel shipwrecked after we leave our boat, while we feel like the waters are overtaking us after we leave our boat, while we feel like nothing else bad could possibly go wrong, Jesus is using that experience to form us, to shape us, and to mold us into something beautiful. We talked about this morning, and I was going to bring this up before Missy did in Sunday school, but we talked about Horatio Spafford, how within a 2-year span, I believe, he lost all 5 of his kids. And yet, even after he lost the 5 of the kids, he sat down and he wrote, "Whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." Friends, we are going to go through times of trials and tribulations. There's no doubt about it. Being a Christian, being a Christ follower does not mean that we won't go through these bad experiences, but it means that we can see the positive in even the most terrible of situations, because God will be forming us through it. I'm going to tell you a truth this morning that you may not want to hear, but I think it's one that we need to be reminded of every now and then. Even your bad experience is nothing compared to other people's bad experience. There are people here in this world who would hurt to have the experiences that we have, even in our most terrible of moments. Even in our most devastating of moments, there are people who envy us. There are people who are jealous of us. What you go through is not as bad as other people. When I was in Haiti, I had the opportunity to go see a house that had just been burned down. I'm sorry, I phrased that wrong. That made it sound like it was an arson, but a house that had just burnt down. They're not exactly sure what caused the fire, but they know that it burnt down. The charred remains were still there. The family still had to live there, though, because they had nowhere else to go. The smoke inhalation was, you could hear it in their coughs, in their lungs. You could see the charred remains. You could hear the devastation in their voice. So I was able to talk with the man that lived there. He lived there with his wife and his two daughters. And through the interpreter, I was able to chat with him a little, and I was telling him, I don't know how I would come back from this after my family lost their house. And he said, quite honestly, this might be the best thing that has ever happened to us. Because, you see, before, we were just in all different corners of the house, not really interacting with each other, not really talking with each other. And now this has made us closer. But, he said that the medical concerns have gone through the roof because of that smoke inhalation. They couldn't get the doctors that we get. They couldn't just get in their car and drive to the nearest emergency room if they needed to. The nearest emergency room for them was miles upon miles away, and they had no way to get there but to walk, or the kindness of strangers, somebody pulling their car over to take them. This is a country who has nothing. They have to walk 2.5 miles one way to get fresh water when we can go to our sink and turn on the faucet. Our experiences are nothing compared to other people. But friends, even when we go through this time of trials and tribulations and just what we think is terrible in the moment, think about the domino effect that it would have, that if we didn't go through it, wouldn't exist. I firmly believe that if my parents did not get divorced when I was 5, I would not be standing right here before you today. And a parent's divorce is probably one of the worst things that a child could go through when they were younger. Friends, I think that this passage really speaks to us in the fact that we turn our attention to other places when we're going through devastation. In fact, in the passage it says it's not exactly completely equal for us, but he says people will come to you and say, I am he, right? He was talking about the false prophets, the ones who say that they were the Messiah, they are the Son of God, they're the ones that can lead us to salvation. And yet in the end, they're the ones that are leading us to the devastation. They're the ones that are leading us to this terrible time. He says that there will be times when we don't want to leave our boat because we want to stay in a safe and secure, even though we are going through terrible times inside that boat. Even though that boat is taking on water, at least we know the boat. We don't know those waters. Friends, I'm not saying that what we go through is not all that bad. All I'm saying is that God forms us when we go through terrible experiences. God shapes us to become the person and the people that we want through these terrible experiences. We have the opportunity that when we go through something terrible, we can just decide that we're going to pack it in and not process what it is that we went through. But in reality, we need to use that to bring joy to God's name, to rejoice to God's name, to bring people into our lives and say, look how far Jesus has brought me. Look how far Jesus has brought me from this terrible, terrible thing to where I am now. God doesn't make us experience the bad things, but through the bad things, God molds us, shapes us, and forms us. He is the potter. We are the clay. In the name of God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the blessed fellowship of the Holy Spirit. Amen.